on this computer. So today's topic is sexual desire. And I mean there are different I guess subcategories that we could talk about if you have questions or whatever, but the basic ethic in Judaism is that two people in a loving, committed relationship, traditionally a marriage, although that is, I think, in the Reform world, not as uh, enforced or not as expected, that people wait till marriage to have sex, but that any two people in a committed, loving relationship can pretty much do anything together as long as it is consensual and in that the confines of such a relationship. There's really no sexual desire that is off limits. However, if it is not consensual and not in the confines of such a what would be considered a sanctified union, then any sexual desire is considered, well, I guess I shouldn't say any sexual desire is considered forbidden, because Judaism is pretty like, your brain is your brain. You can't regulate that, but should not be acted upon. For example, there is a story in the Talmud of a man who is like so lovesick in this like unrequited love situation, and that he literally falls ill, and he's on his deathbed, and the doctors say he will be revived if he is allowed to sleep with this woman. And the rabbis say, like, no, she already said no, so he should just die then. And then the doctors are like, well, maybe if you let him just kiss her, then he can be revived. And the rabbis are like, no, she said no. And the doctors are like, well, what if you just let her like lay next to him? They don't have to actually physically touch, but he can like feel her warmth. And again, the rabbis say, no, he should just die. And like that's the whole story, that she is not his wife. She has not consented to be his wife. She has no interest in him. So this desire, like, tough noogies for him. It doesn't say that he should die, like that his desire for her is so sinful that he deserves death, just that his desire does not merit him to like necessarily have access to her.
What if
So
she's his wife?
what?
What if she's his wife?
What if she's his wife? Then she still has to consent. So there's a whole chapter in the book Sacred Encounter about marital rape, because it was not outlawed in this country until like, what did it say, like the 70s or something, like way too late, way too recently. um and they quote this 17th century judge several times, or sorry, 18th century, 1700s judge several times, which, like, if it wasn't made illegal until the 1970s, it seems like they could have quoted something abhorrent that feels a little bit more contemporary to like make their point. But anyway, but the judge that like made the ruling that there is no such thing as marital rape, that ruling held for 200 years, that he says like the act of marriage is the act of a woman giving herself to a man, and she doesn't have a right to say no. But that was a Christian British judge, that, although his ruling did make its way to this country as well and it held, but obviously not a Jewish viewpoint. The rabbis say that both partners must consent, but also that they do have a marital duty to please each other. So there is a little bit of a tension there. And so they do discuss, this book discusses what that balance is. And I mentioned last week that I had been listening to the podcast Intimate Judaism. I've mentioned it a couple times in this class, but last week I mentioned specifically that I had been listening to it for the purpose of this session because they talk about that topic, that question of sexual desire in a marriage and that what the three categories they like should, shouldn't, or have to, or something like that. Should, can't, and have to, or these are the categories that like no, should, want to, or have to. That's what it is. That the ideal is that both partners want to. The forbidden is for either partner to ever feel like they have to. That middle ground of should is where it gets sticky, right? Because there is this idea in rabbinic Judaism that that physical intimacy is an important aspect of a relationship, and that even outside of procreative sex or couples that are past their um childbearing years, or even when the woman's pregnant or whatever, when it's not just about making babies, couples should still be having sex, and there are expectations from each partner about how often they might want it, and that's for each couple to navigate, obviously. But then there's this question of like, what if, which often I think is the case, one partner wants it more often than the other? Then what do you do? Because the partner who wants it more often should never make the other partner feel forced, and the partner who doesn't want it as often um also has a duty to make the other partner feel affirmed and physically satisfied and intimate in their relationship and all of that. So there's that tension. And they really dive in on both the podcast and in the chapter in Sacred Encounter, not the same marital rape chapter, a different chapter, about this category of like responsive desire. So like you see that your partner is aroused, or like they start kissing and whatever, and the other partner is like not really in the mood, but is like, all right, whatever. This I'm not, I don't have a headache, or like whatever the excuse is. So we'll just go for it. And then it ends up being a pleasurable experience for both, and like they're glad that they did it, and it does like affirm their relationship, and it helps solidify the intimacy and all of those things. So like where does that fall in the category? Like that the other partner, the non-initiating partner, didn't necessarily feel that sexual desire going into it, that they maybe felt like, well, it's something I should do for my partner, but they weren't coerced, they weren't pressured, they certainly weren't raped, there was no violence. What is, and they ended up enjoying the experience, like emotionally, as well as there's also, they talk in the podcast, not in the chapter, I don't think, about the like phenomenon of biological responses, that a person could still not want it and also have a physiological positive response. Like a man could still be erect and not want to have sex, a woman could be wet and not want to have sex, even to the point of achieving orgasm, but it still doesn't mean that it was consensual if there are other factors at play. But in this case, we're not even talking about that. We're talking about like emotionally, and after the fact, the non-initiating partner is still glad that they did it. I'm trying not to use gendered terms here, but I think there is certain, at least stereotype of which gender is more likely to be the initiator and which is more likely to be the passive, like, well, I should do this for my partner. Although, you know, depending on the age of the partners, that it could swap. There are different time periods of life where, you know, that affects this question as well. Um, so that's, I mean, that remains sort of an ambiguous category that it seems the podcasters are Orthodox Jews, and the book obviously is, you know, it's from the CCAR, so it's entirely written by reform, either reform rabbis or like secularized Jewish um like sex therapists and stuff, not necessarily, they don't all identify, all of the doctors, the non-rabbis, they don't identify what like their movement affiliation, but they're not Orthodox. And they wrote for this publication, so you know, presumably reform. So, and so both categories of this like spectrum of Jewish thought, neither seems to know exactly what to do with that middle category of sexual desire, of the like should, not have to, maybe don't really want to, but like should. I don't know. Does that answer your question about what if she's his wife? That there's like a
Yeah.
gradient.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, so that's, oh, the other thing I wanted to say though, so if she is his wife and if it is totally consensual, this question of but all things are permitted, I think also it could shed some light onto some other questions about well, okay, let me back up. So there is a part of the Talmud that says the angels are discussing sex for some reason, and they name a bunch of sex acts that create, like, when done as part of procreative sex, um, although all of the acts involved would not lead to procreation, but like I guess as part of foreplay or whatever, if done during procreative sex, um, will result in like deformed children. So children with speech impediments or mute children are because the couple engaged in oral sex. The deaf children are because the couple, you know, engaged in dirty talk during sex. Um, there's one that happens if they turn the tables, which it's not entirely clear what that means, but we later commentators think it means anal sex. I forget what the outcome of that it would be for the child. Like again, I guess as part of a more general sex night. I don't know, because that would not create a child, but that it creates. Anyway, and then the rabbis come in and say like, no, as long as the only thing that causes bad children or bad seed is if the couple has sex when one or both of them hate each other. So that otherwise all things are allowed between consenting married couples. Which then, like, if the overturning the table, this is what I was going to say, and then I was like, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, let me explain the premise first. If the turning the tables is allowed between consenting married couples, then what would it be about homosexual sex that is forbidden, right? So if we allow gay marriage, then there, you know, like if we sanctify same-sex couples, then there's nothing that's forbidden anymore. Like it clearly had more to do with other social the context of the time and not actually the act itself that is forbidden. So that's the other thing, is that, and the in the Sacred Encounter book, they point out I don't know. It was not my sense that the rabbis in the Talmud point this out. They just disagree. They're just like, no, that's wrong. Um, but the Reform rabbi bringing this story into the chapter in Sacred Encounter points out too, like angels are canonically non-sexual, asexual, don't have a gender. Like what would they know about sex and making babies? It's like one time I was in college, I had the opportunity to hear the Dalai Lama speak, and someone asked him a question about how to raise his children or how to raise her children. And he was like, I'm not allowed to have children. Like, why are you asking me? I've never raised a child. Go ask like your sister. I don't know. So that's kind of like the attitude about the angels here is like, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no context for this. You're sitting on high deciding what sex acts are allowed. A, you're not God, but B, you're not humans either. Like, you don't know. So, um, that's the that's the gist of it. So that was what I at the beginning I said, there are other possible subcategories we can talk more about, but I wanted to just say that much straight out the gate and then open it up to other questions or things you might wonder about Jewish views on sexual desire or permissibility, ethics, um, in this category.
Okay, Rabbi Liz. So the ancient rabbis dealt with homosexuality.
Yes.
Okay, the reason I asked that is because I once read something by an archaeologist,
Mm-hmm.
and the team found an urn with men engaging in homosexual sex.
Uh-huh.
And they stated, and this left an imprint on me, even then they had it.
Yeah. I mean, it contrary to what some people would say, it is a natural form of human sexual expression. It is, like statistically less common um for a person to be exclusively attracted to the same gender. But also it's been so vilified by a lot of cultures over the last several hundred years that like we don't really know what the true statistics are because people don't always feel comfortable coming out. So like, but it is clearly, a natural um expression of human sexuality. People talk about like feeling born that way. We do see it on occasion in the animal world. Um, Less often, but also because most animals don't have sex for pleasure. So they only have sex for procreation. So they don't have that like desire or sexual expression. They only have the instinct to procreate. So it definitely happens a lot less frequently in the animal world than in humans, but it's not unheard of in other animals. Um, Including dolphins, by the way, the only other animal that has sex for pleasure and the only other animal that engages in rape. Um, Although I've also heard that monkeys, chimpanzees, I think specifically, some category of primate, um, has been observed engaging in what appears to be like prostitution behavior. Which I don't know how that falls in the spectrum then of like sex for pleasure, because I mean it's not just for procreation instinct, but there is this like um they've some animal biologist did a study where like the female chimps will have sex with male chimps in exchange for like bananas or like whatever for food, but not necessarily mate with them. So like that's what they said is it's like prostitution, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know again where that falls. in the category of sex for pleasure or like sexual desire of primates. But anyway, that's the animal world. But humans, yeah, I have a pretty wide range of sexual expression. And a lot of what um is seen as acceptable is very contextual. It's very based on the society in which, you know, any individual is or the rules are created. We have a lot of um ideas about homosexuality or about like queer gender and sexual expression um that very much comes from like Victorian England, which by the way also like um had a terrible uh effect. That's not the word I want. Terrible. I don't know. Had a lot of stereotypes about Jewish sexuality as well. Um that was very like I don't know, that Jewish people were sort of inherently queer according to Victorian Europe. Um so it's not, we shouldn't take these things as fact just because that's what society has sort of given to us. The Torah does say that a man should not lie with another man as he would a woman, which has often been interpreted by traditional Jewish sources as well as Christian and European sources as being anti homosexual acts, not necessarily anti like gay people, but that just that sex between two men is forbidden. But that we talked about this maybe, was that 2 weeks ago that we did the topic on LGBTQ issues, that there are lots of other ways to read that verse. And I think the most obvious, I don't know, the most plausible to me is that it's because it also is then immediately followed by you shall not sacrifice your children to Moloch. So it's a weird jump. But we know like from ancient Greece and Rome, which I mean is later than the Torah is written, but still like that we know of ancient cultures that engaged in pederasty, I think is the term for it, but like same-sex abuse of young children. And that might be actually what was being forbidden, is that you shall not abuse boys, basically. So again, not a condemnation then of gay men in a consensual relationship. Yeah.
Rabbi Liz, I
Yes.
once saw a dog. King was his name, very beautiful animal. And he got aroused with no female around.
Yeah. I don't know.
Everybody laughed at him.
Dogs will do that. They hump things. Even um I've seen even like fixed dogs. And I don't know what that, I'm not a biologist. I don't know what they're doing, but I don't think it's about sexual desire at that point. I think it's either some like leftover or like latent instinct thing, or often I think it's a power thing. It's about domination.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I know that male dogs will have the ability to smell a female in heat miles away.
Yeah.
So even though there's doesn't appear to be a female around, doesn't mean there's not something in the air that's not arousing them, you
Right.
know.
And cats also.
That's
I
Yeah.
don't know about cats.
Yeah. My cat, we had a baby, and my God, all the male cats just swarmed. and she was a very a kitten, and all the
Yeah,
male.
they come, cats come to sexual maturity at the age of like 2. I mean, they're still, they seem so young, and then if you don't get them fixed, that's it.
Rabbi Liz, what would Maimonides say? He was big on lists. Did he
Yes,
have
he was
anything to
honest.
say about this? The list
About
of,
which part? He has a lot to say
well,
about
the
everything. The
sexual
man loved to
desires.
talk.
Say again.
The man loved to hear himself talk.
I see. Um, Sexual desire is okay if number one, if number two, if number three. Did he have anything to say about that?
Um, yeah, hold on. He came up a couple times in the last chapter I was just reading. Um, I mean, he definitely agrees with the Talmudic rabbis that the basic, um, of the bottom line is that it must be consensual. It must be, um, between, in a sanctified relationship between two married people. Um, uh, yeah, I don't, I could find later what he wrote about sexual desire specifically, because something did come up about it. Oh no, you know what I was reading? What he, I think, wrote about, or I mean, he wrote about a lot of things. Like I said, I'm sure he does have something to say about, if this, then this, then this about sexual desire. But what I was reading earlier, now I remember, was about sex trafficking, specifically, that um there are questions sometimes about, so like, if in the Torah, in biblical law, if a couple gets divorced and the woman gets remarried, right? Because that's always the language, is marriage. But if the woman has slept with someone else, basically, she cannot remarry her first husband. Um, Theoretically, if they got divorced and she never consummated a relationship with another person, that couple could get back together, the initial couple. Um, so then there are questions of like, is a um is a raped woman then forbidden to her husband, right? Because she has been with another man. And all of the sources, but Rambam especially has like a few kind of like lays down the law about it. That no, like in a case where there is coercive sex, a coercive, how do they phrase it? They have this weird, like, the author in Sacred Encounter, the author of that particular essay that I can't find right now, but he uses this phrase like, it's not an act of sex, but it is a sex act or something, vice versa. Um that so wait, here we go. Rambam says, if she was threatened to remain silent while a sword was being held to her throat, for example, the absence of protest is not an indication of consent. No, that's not the thing. Anyway, that if even though it is a sex act, it is not an act of sex because it was coerced, and so she is still permitted back to her husband. That was the thing I was thinking of, that he had a lot to say about that. They talk about Queen Esther. There's apparently some midrash that Queen Esther was Mordecai's wife, which I guess is fine because people married their cousins all the time back then. But it does also say very clearly in the book of Esther that he was like her foster father. So that's weird. But anyway, according to some midrash, they were married, and after they, defeat Haman and all the Jews are saved, can she go back to Mordecai? And they say yes, because she was like brought she was basically sex trafficked into Ahasuerus's harem. So she's not actually liable for her actions in the palace. Again, it's kind of a weird midrash because the book of Esther itself ends with her still married to Ahasuerus. Like, he's like not a great guy, but he's not the one they really defeat in this story. So I'm not really sure, but I think the homiletical point of the midrash stands that um in a case where there is any kind of coercion, threat, um, lack of agency from the woman, which is unfortunately like a lot of situations back then, um, it's not considered sex per se, and the woman is not liable for any um indiscretion that might be involved there. So like if she's married, it doesn't count as adultery. If she is divorced but wants to return to her prior husband, it doesn't count for that rule. If she is no, those are I guess the two main indiscretions that it would violate. If she is a virgin, if she's not married and thus presumably a virgin, she is still um considered a virgin for all intents and purposes. The rapist has to pay um a virgin's bride price for her, even if she doesn't choose to marry him. He still has to pay it. She can choose to marry him if she's worried about her other prospects. Um, and it was always better to be with a man than no man back then. But she doesn't have to, and he still has to pay her. So those are the categories there. The sages believed that the reason for solar eclipses was when a woman in the city was raped and nobody heard her or responded to her cries. That because they behaved as if they lived in darkness, thus they must live in darkness, like feel that fear of complete darkness during a daytime.
I'd like to bring up the subject. It's a little bit of um, an extension to what we're talking about, but
Yes.
let me see if I can phrase this correctly. Subjugation, psychological, mental, inward subjugation of women.
Uh-huh.
In Mexico, prostitution is allowed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess the Catholic Church said, well, these women don't have any other livelihood, and
Mm-hmm.
so prostitution is allowed, and they're brothels, huge brothels.
Yeah.
However, girly magazines are banned.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and in Persia, Iran, Iraq, and so forth, men pay to watch women mud wrestle.
Okay.
And I believe my intuitive feeling is that they get a kick,
Mm-hmm.
aroused out of women being dirty and being in in a situation where they're sullied, they're they're getting dirty and mud, and they're wrestling, and men pay for that. And my feeling in Mexico is that, like I said, that men are not allowed masturbation.
Hmm.
The Catholic Church forbids that, and but they are allowed to make a living out of prostitution. So, well, I'm sure I went off on a tangent about Mexico, because that's not really subjugation, is it? When a woman is in dire straits and needs to
I
go
mean,
into prostitution.
it isn't some, okay, so here's the thing about, I've talked about this before, I think in this class, but also just a few weeks ago, my sermon right before Purim was about this, right? The question of prostitution and sex trafficking is that some women do engage in sex work consensually, but often it is women who have already been trafficked, or like, something terrible has happened and they don't feel they have other options. Not exclusively. There are also women who just, for whatever reason, it works for their lifestyle and they, whatever, but a vast majority of consensual sex work is from women who did not start doing it consensually or did not feel that they had other options when they started doing it. So that is still subjugation. It's exploitation. It's, that they live in societies that don't let women have regular jobs, or like I said, they were kidnapped and brought to a foreign country, and like what else are they going to do now? They don't speak the language. So even if they get away from their kidnapper, then they just become their own pimp. I don't know what the right term, the socially PC term is for that anymore, but they're still kind of stuck in that. So that's certainly, I think that's still subjugation. Um Judaism um has kind of a weird relationship with prostitution because it does say that it's against it, but then it also like engages in it a lot. Like Jewish people throughout history, from the Torah, right? Like Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, um hires a prostitute who turns out to be his daughter-in-law Tamar, who has tricked him because um he has deprived her of, she married a son, he died, left her childless, and so she is due another one of his sons, and he denies her. So she tricks him into sleeping with her so that she will get pregnant from this line. Um, and when it is discovered that this has happened, neither of them are in trouble for engaging in prostitution. He is in trouble for denying her his son. And that they all agree, like at first when people see she's pregnant out of wedlock, they're like, oh no. And then she like shows his coat or whatever he paid with, that's like obviously his, and explains what happened, and people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense, yeah, that was a reasonable thing for you to do. Shame on him. um so like that's the earliest, but that's Genesis. I mean, it doesn't get earlier than that really in Judaism. And we see that relationship with prostitution in some parts, not so much in the Torah, but in parts of like the prophets in temple, not prophets, in Kings. What in temple times there's like implied lines about um like temple prostitutes, which would have been, sort of a borrowed culture thing from the pagan rites, where, fertility rites and whatever meant having sex in the temple itself as like fertility for the land and whatever. And there's some hints that those kinds of things did happen in the temple in Jerusalem as well, that the Jewish ancient Israelites had some of that, where like again, prostitutes sort of a weird word in that context because they were considered like kind of holy, but they were paid for their services. They lived in the temple. They like did a specific thing. And it was sexual. So it kind of there are stories in the Talmud of rabbis going to prostitutes. Um sometimes Well, I wouldn't say it's ever like depicted as positive, but it has varying degrees of like frowned upon. So like there's one story where a rabbi goes to a prostitute, but he like, this concept of like a bride for one night. So he pays her a bride price and then he gives her a get the next morning. So like he gets around it being prostitution, but like she is a prostitute in that town. He he paid her for sex for one night and then he went on his way. So like there's another story of a man um who goes to a prostitute. I don't think this one's a rabbi, but it's in the Talmud, of a man who goes to a prostitute and but he like feels guilty about it. So he doesn't sleep with her right away. And they just talk and they sit on like she has a bunch of mattresses or something. So they're on like different physical levels as they talk. And then eventually, I don't know, the story goes on and it's kind of ridiculous, but eventually they fall in love and just get married and she stops being a prostitute. And then he didn't commit any sin because they got married for real. Um, there's another one where one of the rabbi's wives feel ignored. So she dresses, and much like Tamar with Judah, she dresses up like a prostitute and seduces him. And then he comes home and is so guilt-ridden and like he like throws himself in the fire or like he's so dramatic. And she's like, she again, like Tamar, she shows him the payment, which isn't just, paper money. It's something that's very obviously his. And it's like, no, look, like it was me. You didn't actually you didn't commit adultery. It was me the whole time. And he was like, but I thought it was someone else. And he still throws himself in the fire. So, like, they, Judaism, like, clearly thinks prostitution is wrong, but like, not wrong enough to condemn it outright. I don't know. um, and then, as Mario said, there are Jewish brothels throughout South and Central America. We in book club we read a novel about this, but there's also mention of it in one of the chapters in Sacred Encounter where she gives the statistics of like in the early 19th century or the early to mid 19th century, like 79% of brothel I forget if it was the brothels or the prostitutes themselves, but like a huge percentage in South America specifically, but I assume that extends if to Central America, if Mario is saying this is the case in similar case in Mexico too, were owned by Russian Jews. That is so many. That's such a big percent. Like what a shanda, really. So that's a complicated history, I think, for us. Anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent. But I think it speaks to, I guess, this topic of sexual desire because clearly it understands like these Jewish stories. I wouldn't say Jewish law per se, because none of these are necessarily told in a context of halakha, but understands that power of desire, that people will do things they know are unseemly because it is also desirous. And in the case of the prostitutes, it's not that they desire it, but that they know that there's a market for it, So it still plays on that question of sexual desire. Women wouldn't be prostitutes if men didn't pay for prostitutes. You know what I mean? Like, the chapter in Sacred Encounter that talked about the ridiculously high percent of South American brothels that were owned by Russian Jews also mentions that the Scandinavian countries have introduced new methods of dealing with prostitution. That the book is like 6 years old now, so I don't know if this has spread throughout more of Europe, which would be nice if it had. But that they have cracked down on arresting Johns, that it is not illegal to be a prostitute. It is illegal to go to a prostitute. And when a couple is caught engaging, when a John and a prostitute are caught in the act, the John is arrested. Again, I guess it doesn't have to be this gendered, but it often is, the vast majority. The John is arrested, and the prostitute gets like social services to help get out of prostitution if she wants, and get like health, get checked out and whatever else, which I think is great. I know a lot of people celebrate the decriminalization completely of, or the legalization completely of prostitution in not just Amsterdam, the whole country, the Netherlands. I just like blanked on the name of that country. The Netherlands. But and for some people, again, that is great. It adds to tax revenue. It's like an above board, thing. They have access to the healthcare and everything like that. But it still means that there is a very high demand for sex workers in the red light district, which leads to still more sex trafficking and exploitation. And it's not all women that are there by choice, even though it is legal, and that should offer more avenues to leave it if that you don't want to be doing it. But because it just creates more like sex tourism, it doesn't actually protect women. So the Scandinavian model sounded pretty great. I hope it catches on.
I'm interrupting a lot. Is anybody? Am I cutting off people here?
I don't think so. Go ahead. Ask.
Oh, okay. There's no reason to suspect that a lot of men are not engaging with prostitutes. There's no reason to believe that. I bet you that a lot of men marry.
I do not know the statistics on that.
Yeah, I don't either. But it leads me to believe that there's sexual boredom, that there might be sexual boredom with one partner.
Yeah, that could be. I think that's part of why, I mean, theoretically, I think that's part of why Judaism does sort of preach a sex positive approach to sanctified relationships. And that it permits anything as long as both partners are consenting, to try to avoid that. But like, obviously that still doesn't answer the whole question, because as we just discussed, like Jewish people were still engaged in prostitution rings. So I think there's more to it than just some kind of lackluster sex life in the relationship itself. I think sometimes it's about like power and knowing you can like own this other person's body for a period of time, which is one of the reasons why at least modern Jewish scholars continue to be very anti sex work, even though it's like trendy in feminist discourse to be pro sex work as long as it's consensual and not trafficking. But that it's still like such an objectification of the body, and Judaism sees the body as a holy vessel, and it should be treated as like a divine, physical manifestation of God's gift to us, right? So that, so that's frowned upon. So I think that's part of it. I also think that there are probably some sexual desires that are still taboo, even though Judaism says anything goes as long as both parties are willing, there are still things that some partners might feel embarrassed to ask their partner to do with them. I admit I didn't get to this chapter yet. Like, I actually didn't read it yet, but there is a chapter in Sacred Encounter on bondage in Jewish relationships. So, like, I'm gonna guess that that's a possible thing where, like, a partner could be embarrassed to ask for certain things in that realm, but they can go to a specific, like, some sex workers specialize in that kind of thing. That you know, so there could be that. And in the case, I mean, in the Talmud, a lot of the prostitution scenes that are depicted are because the husbands are traveling and they get so lonely and they can't be expected to withhold, you know, to hold back for that long. Um, that's the case in the Bride for One Night scenario anyway. He's traveling. So I don't know. I can't, like I said, I don't know statistics. I'm sure a study has been done, but it's not a part of any of the chapters on the topic in this book, because this book is basically like, I don't really care why, like, prostitution is frowned upon in Judaism, the end. So it doesn't really get into what the modern statistics might be of how many married men or men in general. Um, you also probably, it would be hard to get real answers, would be my guess. That would be a difficult study
Yeah,
to do, honestly.
yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
in my practice, I found many times when there was infidelity or even rape, it had nothing to really do with sexual desire, but was more a question of power and control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the power question, the domination thing, is huge in a lot of these unsavory sex acts. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me to hear that that was your experience as well.
Yeah.
Michelle, what about,
Well, sorry, go ahead, Mario.
I wanted to ask, am I interrupting?
No, go on.
Okay, Michelle, I wanted to ask you about in your practice, have you experienced instances of what you described associated with humiliation of a woman?
I would think so. Well, yeah, because I can recall a particular rape case where the man broke into the woman's apartment, but she knew him from the, development. And just, knowing that person, broke in and took advantage of her where a place that she felt safe, that for the woman is humiliating.
Mhm.
And having to go to court to testify against a perpetrator, that's humiliating, to tell strangers what happened to you. So I don't know if necessarily the perpetrator would consider that humiliation part as part of his act, but certainly I think the power and control often rears its ugly head.
Humiliation is sometimes in a situation like where the power and control is the point. I think the humiliation is expected or inherent. Like, otherwise, what
Yeah.
would you be? What? How would the power exertion work if the victim didn't have a reaction? You know. I think that's sort of part of it. It strikes me that that's sort of part of the point. And that's part of the crime, from a Jewish perspective, at least, that we've talked before about this question of like, you know, deflowering a maiden is a huge crime that he has to pay for, but he also, the rapist has to pay for her humiliation, her emotional distress. Like there are five categories, like five counts of different crimes that the rapist has violated, and I can't remember what each. I think like the taking her maidenhead, the violent act itself, you know, the assault, the humiliation, the emotional distress, and then the like financial, um, you know, ruining her bride price or whatever. That he has to pay for each of those things individually for one act of rape. So it's definitely considered. But then like conversely, in the um in some of the prophets, certainly in the book of Lamentations, there's a lot of like imagery of humiliating women as like, I don't know, in the holy text. That's
In the holy what, Rabbi?
in the holy text itself. Like there's a
Okay.
lot metaphor of Israel as a adulterous woman, right? Because Israel is married to God, but has gone astray after these foreign gods, you know, whatever. So there's a lot of imagery in those in certain parts of the prophets and in Lamentations when it's describing Jerusalem being destroyed. It talks about like um you know, a woman paraded through the streets with her clothes being torn off and her head shorn, and the people jeering at her, and all of this is like the punishment. Um, and it's very, I mean, it's again like the humiliation is the point. Um, it's very out there. Not out there as in strange, but out there as in like it's all on display. Like it's all, you know, it's very in your face. um Yeah. Any other questions on this topic? Okay. One
I
last,
had one
oh,
more
okay.
comment,
One more for Mario.
but I feel it would be out of place. And
Go
can
ahead.
I?
Ask it
Can
anyway.
I?
My last thing was going to be a big topic shift anyway, so go ahead.
Okay. Like I read
Okay.
about a bunch of Nazis
Uh-huh.
having a brother and a sister engage in sex so as to laugh at it. It was a gang. I remember it so well. It's a gang of Nazis
Mm-hmm.
forcing a brother and a sister to engage in sex so as to laugh about it. That's ultra humiliation.
Yeah. The Nazis engaged in a lot of sex crimes that um I don't know why I was thinking about this the other day. My brain is broken. I think about genocide. Um
Before you answer, Rabbi, am I out of place to have raised
no,
that point?
no, no,
No?
no. So I was
Thank
going to
God.
say that there are examples in other parts of the world where rape was used as a tool of the genocide itself, right? Like that by forcing impregnation of the women from the, you know, inferior ethnic group, the superior ethnic group could like spread their genes more. So this was done in Bosnia, it was done in Rwanda, of just like mass rapes for the with the explicit goal of the genocidaires spreading their seed to like further squash out the inferior genes. The Nazis had that like blood quantum rule, right? So there was no like spreading their seed to lessen the damage of inferior Jewish genes. They viewed the Jews as so subhuman. They would never have a goal of breeding with the Jews to further enforce their superior German genes on these women. However, it doesn't mean that they raped any less. there was constant sexual abuse happening in the concentration camps from the commanders, commanders on inmates, from capos on inmates. There's a chapter in Sacred Encounter that was very difficult to read, that talked something I had actually never really heard about, although I guess nothing is surprising when you in such inhuman conditions, but where like the capos or the, other sort of privileged prisoners would be given a more inferior, considered more inferior or weak prisoner as like their servant or assistant or whatever, and then they would sexually abuse that, often children. um and the camps were all sexually or gender separated for them, so that was also pointed out, is that these would be self-described heterosexual adults, but molesting same-sex children. And I've not heard that case of the Nazis forcing to a brother and a sister to have sex, but again, like in such inhuman conditions, like nothing is surprising anymore, like they just did terrible things.
Yeah, I was trying to link that to humiliation. That was what I meant to, that they
Yeah.
laughed at this, that they laughed at the humiliation.
Yeah. Um so the last thing that I didn't want to do a whole class on this. It didn't really fit in with any of the um, topics from Sacred Encounter, but in the list of questions that I received, that kind of spurred me to say, like, oh, these kind of all have to do with sexual ethics. So I'll just do like a whole course on that to answer each of these questions. But there was one last question that didn't really come up in this class yet, which is the Jewish view on abortion, which again sort of feels related to sexual ethic, but it's not about the sex itself. So, and it's something I've talked about quite a bit before. So, I just didn't feel like it needed its whole own class. But just to reiterate for anybody listening who had this question, Judaism is not anti-abortion. I wouldn't say it's necessarily pro-choice in the like modern secular liberal sense of the word. But it's, or phrase, but there are certain circumstances in Judaism that require abortion, and certain circumstances that, according to Jewish law, permit abortion. And then some of that is subject to further, analysis based on, it could be based on each individual rabbi or each movement, how loosely you interpret like the threat to the woman's well-being. Does that include financial stability? Does it include whatever? But certainly absolutely required in the case of where her life is threatened. And the Shulchan Aruch even has like a pretty graphic. Is it the Shulchan Aruch or the Beit Yosef? I don't know, one of the books by Joseph Caro, the 16th century halachic scholar. He says like pretty graphically that even up to the moment of birth, if it looks like the birth could kill the woman, we are permitted to like tear the, I mean, at that point, is it still a fetus? That the baby out limb by limb rather than risk the mother's life. Up until the moment that the baby takes its own breath into its own lungs, it is completely permitted to terminate that pregnancy for the sake of the woman. Certainly if the fetus is not viable, like if it's early enough in the pregnancy, or if there's some abnormality in the development that it's like not going to live outside of the womb, absolutely required. And no, it's not considered murder in any of these cases. The the rulings on it, again, they kind of vary based on how far along, how viable the fetus is, how dire the threat, how immediate the threat to the woman's life is. So it's not a very clear black and white situation, but a lot of the reason why so many, contemporary rabbis are very worried about the so-called pro-life movement in this country is because it doesn't allow for a lot of nuance. And so even though there are many cases of abortion that do happen, or might happen in a totally permissible society that we wouldn't agree with Jewishly, I mean, I'm not saying me personally, but like that Jewish law wouldn't necessarily agree with, there is so much that is not allowed in certain states or in certain that is trying to be prosecuted and whatever, that absolutely would not only be allowed, be required by Jewish law. Which that word required, Philip and I once had a discussion, a debate, whatever, several years ago about, like, does that mean, like, what if a woman wanted to try, even if she was told, like, this is a very dangerous pregnancy, you will very likely die, and she thought, well, I would rather, like, as long as the heart is still beating inside of me, the fetus isn't declared dead yet, then I want to still try to bring this baby to term. I think that Jewish law would say no to that. Like, when it says required abortion to save a woman's life, I think it means required. And part of that's like the patriarchal, like, because the rabbis and a lot of rabbis were also physicians in the ancient and medieval times, and so they like had all the control and whatever. But I really think that it would they would not let that go without a big fight, to just let the woman try to carry to term and risk her own life like that. You like, just like you're not allowed to commit suicide, like you're not, you don't get to make that choice, to really put yourself in mortal danger for the sake of a not yet living being, which is how Judaism sees fetuses. So that's that. I wanted to kind of tack that in on the end. I know it's very much like a side note, but it was a question that was raised along with a lot of these other questions about promiscuity and LGBTQ issues and things like that that we addressed in this course. And I've said all of that before, and I just wanted to plug it one more time.
Rabbi Liz,
Yes.
one more, isn't the root of womb to care or something?
Compassion. Yeah, it's the same root
Compassion,
as
right?
compassion or mercy.
Right.
Yeah.
So I read in David Moranis's book, say, I forget the name. I should know this because that book matters a lot to me. Oh man, what an embarrassment. Anyway, Moranis says womb the care, therefore the baby is hers because
Yeah.
she's caring for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
leave it alone. Come here.
The rabbis say it's like an extension of her limb,
Mhm.
the fetus. So like
Yeah.
in Numbers,
Yeah.
there's a story where a lot of the later Jewish law on abortion builds out from, but there's a story where two men are fighting and one knocks into a pregnant woman. Like, it's an accident, but he hurts her and causes her to miscarry. And he's due he has to pay her damages similar to if he broke her leg. He is not liable for murder. And so from that we learn that the rabbis say that, like, up until the fetus would be viable outside her body, it is considered like a limb, and not a life.
I see.
So yeah, I do like that wordplay though that you see sometimes in Hebrew poetry of womb and compassion,
Mhm.
rechem,
Leave him alone.
rachamim.
Rahem
Yeah,
is the word that Moranis uses.
yeah.
Yeah, God, I wish I could remember the name of the book. Darn it.
Well, email it to us all later if you think of it.
Yeah. If you give, I've got it right here. Just a moment.
Okay.
Everyday Holiness.
Oh, I know that book.
Yeah, by David Marinas,
I haven't read it, but it's a very
founder of
popular.
founder of the Musar Institute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well respected book.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Definitely.
Okay. Well, this has been a lovely course on sexual ethics. Thank you all for attending. In June, so we're going to take a nice long break, and then in June, we're going to talk about messianism, messianic thought in Judaism. I'm hoping to get a guest speaker for at least one of the sessions because this is not my topic of expertise. It delves a lot into like mysticism and stuff. So it just depends on. I've made contact with a few possibilities. It depends on what they ask for and if we can afford it. But I'm hoping to bring in some guest speakers for that one. So stay tuned. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,